Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alan Feder, the Chief Executive from the Rail Industry Safety Standards Board, and welcome to today's Masterclass webinar, which is held in recognition of World Standard Day 2025. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we meet and dial in from today. I'm in the Macedon Ranges in regional Victoria, so that's Jaja Wurrung, Tungarong, and Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung land. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend a warm welcome to anyone who's from Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander today here with us. So, World Standards Day. I know there's a different day every single day. There's Donut Day some days, and then there's World Standards Day. So World Standards Day is a celebration of the collective efforts of thousands of experts and volunteers around the world who develop and apply standards that make our systems safer, make our products more reliable, and make us as an industry more connected. And if we think about it, standards are really the cornerstone of collaboration. It brings people together to drive improvements in interoperability. And the most important thing for our sector is it fosters trust and it drives cooperation to ensure that we're able to continuously improve and find safer ways of doing things. This year's World Standards Day internationally is exploring collaboration and what it means across industries, and importantly, how you bring government, how you bring organisations and industry together to drive improvements in standards and harmonisation. And that's really fitting for us here in Australia and for us in the rail industry, because we're talking about one of the most significant times in our rail industry when it comes to reform and it comes to standards. Michael Hopkins will talk to us today about how we are using the National Rail Action Plan to bring standards back to the heart of everything that we do across our rail sector, to drive that improvement in collaboration, foster that trust, and increase interoperability across our networks. But before we get into the exciting rail discussion about standards, I thought we should take a step back. Let's go and do a little bit of a one-on-one on standards themselves. So, standards at the end of the day are pretty simple. They are traditionally voluntary documents, and we're going to talk about that notion of voluntary and mandatory a little bit later today. But historically, standards have been voluntary documents that specify procedures, guidelines, and the idea is they improve commonality or standardization across services and products to drive consistency, productivity, and most importantly, safety. But you probably don't realize that there are standards in every aspect of your life. We just don't realize them. We don't read the codes. We don't need to. We have that trust. Whether you're on a treadmill in the morning at home or at the gym, whether you're cycling and wearing a safety helmet, whether you're turning on the taps at home, behind every one of those items is a standard. And you'd be surprised that a number of them are actually mandatory. So in our rail sector, we talk very much about voluntary standards. But what we don't realise is across many sectors in Australia and internationally, many standards are mandatory. And Michael will talk about what the approach is for mandatory standards in Australia. The other interesting thing is that there are new standards, mandatory standards being implemented across Australia quite regularly. In fact, in May this year, the toppling furniture standard was introduced, and it's a mandatory standard for any of you who enjoy shopping at Kmart or IKEA, like to buy your flat pack furniture. Well, all those stickers on there that warn you about the risks of toppling furniture, they're part of a mandatory standard that ensures that there is greater risk mitigation and management for some of this furniture that's becoming easier and more accessible and cheaper to purchase. These are just the little things that makes life easier, that makes our lives safer without us having to really think about them. They're being thought about by suppliers, by businesses, by industries for our benefit as consumers. And that's the same for the rail sector. We wouldn't expect all our passengers on our passenger services to know our standards or to understand them. And we wouldn't expect those who are using our freight services to know our standards in detail. But they foster trust and they create confidence in our networks. And that is one of the important values of standards. But more importantly, or not more importantly, but just as importantly, standards also can create greater trade and economic benefits, particularly when we start to look at international standards and how they might apply here in Australia. Not only do they increase supply chains into Australia, but it also creates greater economic opportunities for Australian businesses to take their products and services internationally. So broadly, standards create a great opportunity to help our businesses and our services thrive. So now that we kind of feel like we know the 101 of standards and why they're so important, it's important that we talk about rail and rail standards. As many of you know, in August, Australia's infrastructure and transport ministers endorsed a new governance model for standards in Australia and a new rail industry safety standards board as the industry-led technical standards setting body for rail. Now, this is a really big change for RISSB, and as we take on a stronger and more formal role in shaping the standards that underpin the national rail system, we know that there is a lot of work for us to do. And we are starting that work now to create the new RISSB, whether that's developing a new standards prioritisation framework with industry and government, whether it's redesigning our standards development process to have greater quality standards that will support greater adoption, and as a result of that, greater harmonisation across our rail sector, through introduction of a new technical assurance group that will provide greater peer review throughout the development of our standards, again, to foster trust, to build the confidence that those standards are good to implement and should be easier to adopt. Right through to doing a full review of our own organisation, our own structures, our own capability, and the roles and resources that we need to be a successful standards body for the future. And importantly for all of our members, we're also doing the work to understand what is the value proposition for being a RISSB member into the future. So a simple government decision means a lot of work for us, but without member support and industry support, we can't do it. So days like today are really important because they remind us of how important it is as an industry to back standards and the development of standards into the future. Now, I've heard some rumours or lots of questions or myths since that decision in August about what's changing in our standards landscape. I've heard things such as, oh, are all standards going to be mandatory from here on? I've heard things such as, or questions such as, does industry no longer have a role to play in the development of standards? I've heard questions such as, are we moving away from a co-regulated standards process and model? Now, the truth behind all of that is, the answer is pretty simple. No, we're not. The strength in our industry, in our standards development process, is that industry-led way of working. That's the strength of an organisation of RISSB. We can bring industry together, but without industry, we can't drive greater harmonisation. So today, as we talk to our panel, who I'll introduce in a moment, it's important to keep in mind that we're not changing our co-regulated industry-driven standards development process. But we are making some changes across the board around how standards are going to be defined between mandatory, harmonised and localised standards. Again, Michael will talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So today, the aim is to have a discussion around why it's crucial for us to keep focusing on standards in our rail sector and why the time is right now to create a new RISSB and what it means for all of us across industry in a new three-tiered standards framework. I'm really pleased to be joined, as I said, by Michael Hopkins, who is the National Transport Commission CEO. Also from the Australian Rail Transport Corporation, we've got CEO Wayne Johnson, and from the Victorian Department of Transport and Planning, representing states' perspectives across Australia, so that's a big onus on you, Lockie. We've got Lachlan McDonald, who's the Executive Director of Intergovernment Relations. So thank you all for joining us. I'll shortly invite Michael Hopkins to share his insights into the new rail governance model and what it means for industry. And then we'll open it up to questions from me to the panel. And at the end, we'll answer any of your questions. So please, throughout today's session, if you got questions, please go into the Q&A tab and put your questions in there, and we'll get to them at the end of the panel discussion. And of course, if we can't get to all of them, we'll come back to you after today's session. So again, thank you for joining us for today's celebration of World Standards Day. And I'm going to hand over to Michael.
Great, thanks, Alan. And I do want this to be a conversation, a free-flowing conversation, like a sort of intimate conversation between Alan, Lachlan, Wayne, myself, and 311 of our closest friends. So great to see so many of you here, and a lot of familiar names. But before we get into the panel discussion and questions, I thought I'd give a bit of a background about how we got here and why we're having this conversation today. I'll start with a little bit of a history lesson going back 5 years. And in 2019, the ARA, on behalf of industry, had an audience with Australia's transport ministers, the Infrastructure and Transport Ministers meeting. And at that, they made a really compelling case for change and talked about some of the burning issues that were facing the industry. One of the major ones at that point was the looming incompatibility of digital signalling systems between our urban and freight networks, what we were calling the digital breaker gauge. And if we'd left that unresolved, it risks dividing the national rail network. So governments, industry and the ARTC came together, and through strong collaboration, ministers decided in August, as Alan said, that all of our future digital signalling systems on the national network must comply with mandatory ETCS standards. Major decision and a really important achievement, and makes sure that we don't repeat the problems of 150 years ago. But it wasn't the only challenge. And across our networks, we've had countless different rules, processes, standards and ways of working. And all too often, these differences have put productivity and safety at risk. They cost us more and they slow us down. So ministers tasked us with exploring how we could drive harmonisation across the industry, reduce some of those differences and start taking a national approach. I've sometimes, when people talk about the Australian rail network, I have to point out there really isn't one. There's a dozen rail networks in a trench coat pretending to be an Australian rail network. What we need to do, though, is we need to move closer and closer to a single national approach. And as part of that, our voluntary opt-in approach to standards wasn't working, and it failed to give us the consistency that we needed. So we heard from government, industry, regulator that to achieve a more interoperable, productive and safer rail system, we needed to take a stronger approach. So as part of that, one of the things that ministers agreed to was a 3-tiered approach to national rail standards. And this comes to Alan's earlier point about will standards become mandatory. Because one of the things that we really need to do is we want to retain all of the benefits of the co-regulatory system, which have arguably made a safer rail network over the last decade, but deal with some of the challenges that approach has given us. So the 3-tiered approach to national rail standards consists of top tier, first tier of standards that are mandatory, and that's where interoperability is absolutely essential, such as digital train control systems. The second tier of standards, and probably one that we'll spend a bit of time talking about today, are the harmonised standards that lift national productivity, covering areas like operating rules, rolling stock componentry, and workforce training. And finally, a third tier where local standards where we allow local standards because interoperability isn't affected. So it's a pretty big shift, and we're moving from individual networks doing their own thing to a more strategic national focus. And with interoperability requirements being embedded into the law, as it will be through the Rail Safety National Law, it's clear that the stronger role for government and our industry bodies need to play. So in coming up with the concept of a national standard setting body, we put a number of options to ministers. They contemplated an expanded role for ONSRA, creating a new statutory body, or strengthening RISSB. The expanded role for ONSRA was ruled out by itself as it would largely be a conflict for the regulator to both be a standard setter and enforcer of the law. Now, that's not to say that there won't be a bigger role for ONSRA, because we still need them to take on a bigger role, but not as the standard setter. Ministers also didn't want to set up a new body. The history of intergovernmental relations in Australia and transport reform, and Lachlan will know this better than anybody, it can often take a decade between the decision to create a new body and for that body to be actually up and running. Ministers, so that's really why we wanted to avoid that situation, or we'd still be here in 5 years arguing about the detail of what a new body would look like. So ministers decided that a new strengthened RISSB would be the best place to take on that larger role. They agreed that the best way to deliver the reforms in a co-regulatory environment was for an industry-led organisation to be involved in developing national standards with a stronger alignment to national priorities. It means moving away from voluntary adoption towards a more coordinated national approach that brings public and private operators into alignment. The new RISSB will need to lead the development of harmonised standards that support productivity with input from industry and governments. And Alan talked about the prioritisation framework, so understanding what both industry and government sees as what are the most valuable things, what are the most urgent things for us to harmonise. In terms of the tier 1, the mandatory standards, because those will need to be approved by ministers under rail safety national law. The NTC will continue to coordinate those, but we expect to have a lot of input from RISSB, bringing that voice of industry. So there'll be a more proactive role for Onsra with options to strengthen its interoperability remit. And some of you will be aware of the interoperability management plan regulation that's will be enforced quite shortly. So coming together, this is a pretty big change, especially for RISSB. So we're going to depend a lot on Alan and the team, but we're confident that they can do that. So that's the direction we're heading, a new unified approach that supports a safer, more efficient and more productive rail system. So looking forward to the discussion, and I hope that's been a useful intro. Alan.
Thanks, Michael. Before we go to the other panelists, Michael, you talked a little bit about harmonised standards being probably the crux of what we're wanting to talk about. But before we go to that, I did say in my early introduction that historically standards have been voluntary.
Yep.
So interested in your perspective around why do we need to make the shift to some standards being mandatory in the rail sector?
I think this comes back to your earlier comment about the value of the co-regulatory model that we've had in place for a decade now, and arguably the Onsra model, the co-regulatory model, has meant significant improvement in safety over the last decade, and that's been one of the that really comes from the ability of industry, of the different industry participants, whether you're a RIM or an RSO, to be able to find your own pathway to safe so far as is reasonably practical. So arguably that's given us the ability for individual players to maximise their own safety through the ways that they understand and see fit. Where it falls down though is that is interoperability. It's not optimised for networks to behave as a single network. So what that means is that we're going to need a greater focus for mandatory standards, particularly on those areas where the network's going to require it for interoperability. So it saves us things like having to dual fit rolling stock with four different signalling systems and so on. But that's really the crux of it, trying to separate the benefits of co-regulation and some of the areas where where it needs some help, and that really is about interoperability.
So talking about interoperability, Wayne, I might go to you. I mean, that's one of the key words where lots of people have different views of what it actually means. So from an ARTC perspective, what does interoperability mean for you, and how do the new standards framework actually support the work that you're doing and projects such as Inland Rail?
Thanks, Alan, and thanks everyone for joining in this afternoon. Wayne Johnson, as Alan's indicated, CEO, MD at ARTC. Just to put it in some perspective, but also to get some practicality to it. If we think about interoperability as a theme or a mindset, that at the end of the day, trains transit across the country, and the job is to make sure that can happen, with the exception of where there's a gauge divide that still exists across Australia. So if we think about the sub-processes, the types of requirements for trains, for drivers, for the industry. We want that to work as seamlessly as possible, particularly when you're dealing with the type of distance that we are in Australia, because that's where you get economies, that's where you get standardised approach and better safety outcomes, because everyone knows what you're doing. You actually get some real robustness and rigidity in those approaches. And on special occasions, you actually get to differentiate at that 3-tier level in some areas that you might have special needs that you can differentiate. And that means you're actually then focused only on the exception at these either locations or peculiar arrangements. So I think, firstly, to get to systems, processes and tools that work like that, Australia is headed to a far more seamless, cost-effective, safer transport system. Now, we're not flat-footed in rail. We quite often across the rail sector, we're our own worst enemy in terms of being quite critical of where we are. We're not flat-footed. We're certainly not at aviation level. And if you think about where our aviation is, pretty much the same plane, same equipment globally. But we are better than local manufacturing, some other organisations, particularly other large industry sectors, that actually go about things quite differently, and they compete by differences. I guess the challenge for us is, as we head toward not competing by difference, but getting better economies and safer outcomes, it is to continue that mindset about what am I prepared to do in our business that adjusts slightly so that we can line up with those businesses around us. That remains a fundamental piece of work for us. Now, when it comes to, and you talked about standards for what will be, if you like, our systems of work or the tools of trade in a digital age, the reality is that along with that decision around RISSB's role and that 3-tiered approach in August was also the decision around the pathway to ETCS being a foundational layering of our network control systems and if you like, the digital train control, communication and tools as we head forward. Now, that decision, whilst everyone on the call would say is not rocket science, it has taken some time to get to a point where there's enough substance and veracity to align pretty much nationally across the country on a pathway that's a long-term pathway to head towards something that is the opposite to our physical gauge divide today. And it sets a really strong foundation if we can go about it correctly. When I say correctly, that literally leverages the experiences that have happened to date internationally, particularly through Europe, to make sure we don't end up with creation or, if you like, barriers that become embedded to non-standardisation. So the beauty is, while some of the networks in the country have started some implementation around the ETCS journey and that pathway, most of the country is still in either design or decision mode, and so it's an opportunity to really get those alignment as we head that pathway. Now, for ourselves, if you put that opportunity, that decision around direction, and then ARTC, we currently operate and manage around just over 80% of the national network. And we have been tasked and accepted the responsibility of working through the development of a business case with industry involvement for a non-urban, what we've dubbed the non-urban deployment of this type of pathway across not just our network, but what it might look like in non-urban deployments. Now, without that clear standard and without the harmonisation approaches in processes, it's going to be really difficult to get a unified approach in a digital system and a set of tools that help people nationally without that backdrop of that. And I think that also reinforces the need for RISSB's refreshed role, if you like, Alan, in that approach. Now, in simple terms, a lot of people remember the days where we had different radios in different jurisdictions in trains, and we end up with a single unified radio system, which is the ICE radio system. Quite similar to that, if we think about ETCS, without a set of standards, continuing to either duplicate or do things differently for the sake of it. And there are examples that have happened through Europe where we end up with either jurisdictions or two different countries, even with an ETCS pathway, have adopted different products that don't work together. And so this is the opportunity nationally for us to learn from that and not head there. Whilst the endeavour would be really good if we could all just agree and head that way, standards are the backdrop. They are the thing that hold us to that. And you've given some really practical examples today, Alan, of exactly that, which is why we all get in a car and seatbelts operate the same way. It's why when we get in a car, we've got a similar level of requirements that we all get familiar with driving. And so you can do that in a unified approach pretty consistently across the nation.
Thanks, Wayne.
I might come back to the inland rail component and some other opportunities in a further section.
Sure. Thank you. Lockie, if you think about, obviously, you know, Wayne's looking after a significant part of our national network or the NNI. From a state's perspective, one of the challenges historically, certainly for RISSB, in having our standards harmonised and adopted consistently and nationally has been the variances between states and state jurisdictions. So from your perspective, how do you see this new standards framework of mandatory, harmonised and local? How do you see that helping the states and the territories working more effectively together? And importantly, how do you see our role in supporting that consistency and improved adoption of standards?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I think it's going to help a lot. Victoria, and I think all the states and territories transport departments and ministers over the years have been really keen to see greater harmonisation of standards and the reforms that are now being moved to implementation. And I think ministers and transport officials have arrived at that view because of the advocacy by groups like ARA, Forge, and the members on the board of RISSB. I think back to that very important meeting in 2019 when Danny Broad, as head of ARA, presented that compelling case for reform to the standards development framework in Australia. But I also think back to around 2014, 2015, when the National Rail Safety Regulator had been put in place, and nearly all the states had come into that model in one form or another. But within, you know, a year or so, I was remembering some workshops that were convened by the National Regulator to talk about where to from here. And a number of the big operators and rail manufacturers came back to standards all the time and said, as well as concerns about, you know, RISSB, terrific organisation, but the model isn't quite delivering what we want. We're not achieving the quality of standards we always want that enable that more universal adoption. But the other message that came through very clearly from industry to Sue McCary, to Julie Bullis when she was there, to the regulator herself, as Sue McCary was, you really should have at least a couple of mandatory standards. That would help industry. So it really, this conversation, a lot of it was triggered by what industry was telling us they would prefer to help them run their businesses. And of course, the intention, as you said, Alan, is not to come along with a whole lot of new things that are mandatory all of a sudden. It's really to take a couple of things that have to be done around rail networks, but have a common mandatory standards and a very small number of them. I think the other thing for jurisdictions is the cost of procurement of rail projects and of maintaining infrastructure and commissioning new infrastructure in Victoria, but we're not unique. We've had the problem occur time and time again that V-Line and MTM have different standards to each other and to ARTC, and the cost that adds in a period where we're all doing very large investment in rail, and that's fantastic, all the big rail projects we're building, but it adds to the cost, and it makes it harder for our transport ministers to persuade state treasurers and state premiers to fund those projects when people become aware that we are building in inefficiencies into how we do this in Australia. Just one or two other things I'd mentioned that are really important to the states. More uniformity and harmonisation of standards means that workforce mobility and workforce portability becomes easier. We don't have people that have to be trained 7 times over to do similar jobs around Australia. That's been an impediment in a period of very significant infrastructure and labour shortages, skill shortages. So again, all the states want to overcome that. the final one is going to Alan's point about ETCS. As we all move to digital signalling, ETCS on the Eastern Seaboard, we don't want to be in a position where we have anything different between Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria and ARTC, because we want to have suppliers that can supply to any of our rail systems, any of our jurisdictions. We don't want extra costs. We want a deep and broad supplier market. And the final thing we want is, and this is the other thing that's driven the states a lot, we have tried to retain local manufacturing rail capacity, making rolling stock. Victoria's probably been able to do that more than some of the other jurisdictions over the years. New South Wales, Queensland, WA, now getting very active in that space. But to maintain the competitiveness of local rail manufacturers, you need commonality of standards around Australia for rolling stock as much as possible for the componentry. We got that going with bogies and glazing and other things, but we had to go to RISSB and pay for that work ourselves. We were doing it because we were trying to create economies of scale for the rail manufacturers in Australia so that they could survive and flourish. So multiple benefits from the public policy outcomes that state governments are responsible for. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Lockie. I think importantly, when we talk about economies of scale, and we've all spoken about the fact that we're not expecting to have too many mandatory standards. So we're still going to be relying very heavily on standards being, to a large extent, voluntary. So, Michael, I'm interested in understanding from a policy perspective and, consultation that's occurring over the next 12 months on the policy and changes to the Rail National Safety Law that the NTC is leading. How do you see greater support for those voluntary standards, or what we're calling harmonised standards in the future? So whilst you mustn't, you're not absolutely required by law to comply with those standards, we want to move to an environment where industry should adopt harmonised standards and should feel comfortable and confident in them. So perhaps can you tell us a little bit more about what the NTC is doing to create greater confidence in that space, and how can industry be involved over the next 12 months?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, Alan. So if you think back to the original rationale for doing this, sorry, I've lost the question, Alan.
That's right. It's around the policy position around harmonised standards and the changes to the Rail National Safety Law.
So some of you will know last year, in conjunction with Tom Sargent, much beloved rail expert, we did a review of Rail Safety National Law, and with that, one of the clear messages that came out of that was RSNL is working fairly well, but there aren't any strong hooks and drivers for interoperability. So one of the first things to come out of that was the requirement was the development of a regulation to require an interoperability management plan. That's now in place. But the next part of it is really the bit of work that is trying to design the law around what standards need. So what that's going to mean is amendments to the RSNL that we will be consulting with industry and the community on more broadly later during 2026. And bringing together both the RSNL review from last year and the work that we've been doing leading up to the decision that ministers made in August about the new role for RISSB. So these legal changes will effectively give RISSB that accountability and that responsibility. But equally, one of the things that we need to do, given that we've done some research, we know, and some of you will have seen the GHD report that was commissioned by ARA, RISSB, and ourselves and ONREC into why weren't standards being adopted. And there are lots of reasons, and I can put my hand on my heart and say, as an organisation that was deliberately set up to harmonise things like rules and laws, I can tell you I get two responses when I say, we should really harmonise this. And the two responses I get are, yes, we should absolutely harmonise this to my standard, because my standard's clearly the best. And if everybody adopts that, that's harmonised. The second reply you get is, we should absolutely harmonise this but we are different. So one of the things we need to do is strengthen the case for both mandatory standards and for the harmonised standards that maybe don't quite meet the test of we absolutely need these, but we need something very much like them. So one of the things that we will build into rail safety national law is some abilities for the regulator to. So at the moment, the regulator has the ability to give due regard to various standards, including RISSB standards. We want to strengthen that. So that might mean if you comply with a particular standard, if you can demonstrate to the regulator that you comply with this standard, then you're considered to be safe. If you don't adopt that standard, and there's obviously long lead times for these things, and we're not expecting everything to happen on day one. This will be something that emerges over time. But the other thing will be if you don't adopt a harmonised standard, a tier 2 standards, then maybe you've got to convince the regulator what you're doing is better and why it's better. So to have some of those hooks in the law to strengthen, so harmonised standards aren't mandatory, but they're more mandatory than they are at the moment, if I could put it that way. It feels a little bit like half pregnant, but they will have more teeth, if I can put it that way.
So Michael, that is a change to what's in place today. So importantly, from a industry perspective, how do they get involved over the next 12 months in providing input to those changes? Because at the moment, you'll be going out to consultation, I understand.
Yes. No, thanks. Thanks for that very carefully worded reminder, Alan. That's very good. So we are at the moment finalising what we call a RIS, a regulatory impact statement, and RIS has come in 2 stages: a consultation RIS and a decision RIS. That consultation RIS essentially spells out the argument for why do we need to change, what are we trying to achieve, what are the outcomes that we want out of these changes, and then here are some proposed changes that deliver on these. Please provide comments, and there'll be a series of questions, and I think at the moment we're up to about sort of 50 to 60 questions, really just to help focus people's thinking as they're working through the statement. But that will happen. That will be out in the public in the first half of 2026. Over the middle of 2026, we'll be listening, bringing all of that feedback together, and developing a final policy position that we will put to ministers in the second half of 2026. That then, having gone through that consultation, during the consultation phase of the regulatory impact statement, and then having a decision regulatory impact statement, which everybody will see. And what that will have is here's what we heard, and here is how we've changed things, or here's how we think that this doesn't require any change, or however it is. But everybody will be able to see how their consultation was dealt with. That then goes as a recommendation to ministers in the second half of 2026. And out of that, if ministers endorse that position, we will then start drafting amendments to the RSNL.
So Michael, apologies.
No, I was going to say, so the first half of 2026 will be deep in engagement with industry and the broader community.
So as Michael, you're going through that consultation process, it's important for our members and for industry to be thinking about what harmonised standards means and what some of those complexities are to implementing them, to be able to shape back your input to the consultation process. So I might ask Wayne, because it's not just about the NTC's policy positions. When we think about ARTC, you've got a number of operators on your network. You're probably the greatest example of all the different variabilities from different providers who are on your network. What do you think are the complexities to moving towards this harmonised model where they're not compulsory standards, but they are important standards, and one that we're saying that industry should adopt where they can? What do you see the complexities are for your network and all the operators on there?
Thanks. I think we start with some symmetry. So Michael talked a bit about the policy, regulatory, and sort of you touched on the funding as well. If you think about an approach to just about everything across the sector, all of us on the call deal with today, is an ageing asset a change or an implementation of a new type of equipment, a new componentry, new training. So Lockie talked about the training load and the differences across the country. So when you add all that up together with a multiplicity of policies, regulations, different requirements, how you fund those, and a whole scattering, then that synergy gets pretty watered down to everyone doing their own, right? And so the really sizable first task is, the first thing that's probably going to be challenged is multiple policy directions. And for everyone that's on this call, when you start thinking about, oh, this seems pretty harsh, mandatory standards, and what does that mean? Imagine a world where policy becomes clearer and more unified. How easy is it for us to get around and do our job, right? Now, many people across organisations can go, right, how easy is it that I do the same thing here that I did somewhere else? Now, the reality is that the barriers to that is like any standard. So if we think about staircases in Australia, they've changed multiple times in terms of standards, and there'll be staircases that were built in the 60s versus one that was built last year, and they were different. But what the commitment is when you do something about that building or you upgrade, you actually move to that standard. So this is not, by the way, next month, we've got to deal with every one of those complexities across every component. This is about how we had a pathway so that in a decade time from now, we are so much closer in terms of alignment. By the time you get to the end of that journey and renewal of both assets and activities, we are far more unified than where we currently are, which is where those economies, safety, foundational safety in design, and just general ease comes from. Now, if every organisation under the co-regulatory model and its risk-based approach still wants to differentiate because they believe they've got a high risk or they've got something else to do or a different location, then we're going to be challenged around how far mandatory actually leads to. So there's a complexity in terms of adoption and change management within an organisation. And if you think about a supplier today, let's think about a supplier that's delivering componentry for either wayside devices or crossovers or points management in our networks today. How many different components and style of components does that supplier need to have on tap, continue manufacture, keep stock of? All of those multiplicities over time, Alan, they start to become more uniform, but it's not a simple pathway. So how do you eat the elephant? I would say we don't need someone eating at the trunk and someone else at the calf. We actually need to have some really sized, where are the priority areas that we're going to eat the elephant together across the industry, which is the approach that's been adopted. Because we can't do this all at once across every component. And that lies the opportunity as well. You mentioned inland rail, so projects of greenfield type nature, the ability to grab this now and go, all right, well, this is the approach, this is where we're going. How do we build into those new standards at the outset and when we're constructing greenfield areas or whether we're upgrading capital works? That is a fantastic opportunity for across the sector to get rid of some of those complexities with capital work.
I think, Wayne, that's a really important point that you made earlier around that it's not about changing straight away or immediately. It's about when there's an investment decision being made in the future. And I think that's why it's so important that we all understand that this will become a long-term benefit realisation for us. But it's important that we all understand the framework that we're moving to, even though we may not be making decisions in our own local businesses immediately. It's generally when you are making that investment decision. Even, Michael, when it relates to a mandatory standard. So perhaps can you just talk a little bit more about when a mandatory standard comes in, particularly one such as ETCS, that it doesn't mean that everyone has to comply with it immediately, but what does it mean? When does someone need to comply with it?
Well, essentially, and building on what Wayne was saying, it's when you make a change or so in the case of ETCS, if you're about to invest in digital train control, it will need to be an ETCS solution. Now, that doesn't mean that your signalling system needs to be upgraded to digital. There may be cases where a non-digital solution will work in the interim or the short term or in a low risk environment. But if you are on the NNI and you are going to invest in digital train control, then it must be ETCS. And that's the principle across the board. Rail assets, as we all know, can last for decades. 20, 30, 40 years is not unheard of. So we've got to get the most out of the assets we've got. So we're not asking people to spend billions and billions of dollars overnight on upgrading to ETCS or complying with whatever other mandatory standards. Everything will be done from a, if you like, grandfathered position. So the past is grandfathered in, but when we're changing, you'll need to comply with the standards.
So we've spoken so far about mandatory standards and which you must comply with at the particular point in time. And we've talked about harmonised standards, which we are saying that you should adopt where you can. But we haven't really talked about localised standards. So that third part of our framework into the future, and they're standards where you can adopt your own standards where you need them. Lachlan, can I ask you, what do you see, and particularly in a state like Victoria, where you have a highly franchised rail network, how do you see local standards working, and why is it important to maintain some operational flexibility in a standards environment?
Absolutely, because I think there's pretty wide consensus, I think, in Australia and government and industry that the co-regulatory model has worked well. And what we don't want to lose is the capacity for industry to bring its expertise, to bring innovation, to bring efficiency to how it wants to run its business, any rail business. So we want to retain as much as we can where if there's not a need for mandatory or harmonisation, if there's not a need for that, let industry keep being able to make the calls, let individual businesses make those calls about what works best for them. I think if we have a standard in Victoria, I'm pretty sure MTM's got a standard for the dimensions of car parking spots in railway car stations. Well, we'll leave that to ourselves and don't need to trouble other states how you do that. So there's and the other thing I think you've got to, of course, remember, as we all know, the rail systems in Australia are very, very different in each state and territory. The passenger networks are very, very large in Melbourne and Sydney, by world standards. Brisbane, not so much. Adelaide, Perth, smaller. It's both a scale thing and the historic nature of systems that have been used. So to not get in the way of the rail industry doing what it does well, very high standard of people operating systems safely in Australia, the co-regulatory model working well. Let's retain that flexibility, capacity for innovation and people to make the business decisions that they want to make.
Thanks, Lockie. I'm just going to do a quick reminder to everyone who's participating today. If you do have any questions for our panel, please do enter them into the Q&A. I've got one final question for the panel, and then I'm going to go to the participants' questions. Wayne, again, on your national network, again, as it spans so many jurisdictions, we see a lot of benefit in interoperability on your network, but what do local standards and localised flexibility still mean for a network like yours?
Thanks, Alan. A bit like Lockie said, although there's a principle up front, which is probably justifying why do we need to be different in an area. So start with the concept that we should standardise and then ask the question, why does it need to be different rather than the other way around? That is a changed approach. And we have been approaching that in our organisation now for a few years pretty consistently. But no doubt there'll be some either high risk areas, circumstances, requirements, or some bespoke things that are not peripheral to take the rest of industry's focus in that. But what I would say is this, and Lockie talked about whether it's passenger trains and the likely or systems and the type of capability that Australia might be able to bring to build our own capability internally to look after ourselves there. In that case, we're actually talking about Australia being more competitive because of the standardised rail system. If you think about our customers, and predominantly our customers outside the passenger task is freight, whether it's bulk or containerised freight across the country. And their real competitors are adjacent transport modes. And so what they're driving us to do is actually get more and more standardised all the time, because that's where their efficiency is, that's where they get to compete. So if you think about who their competition is, it's not an international supplier from Spain or Japan on a train. It's actually the road industry predominantly, where these things have been done now for 20 to 30 years in a pretty consistent standardised way. And so it's not just ourselves, whether it's a state jurisdiction in passengers, whether it's our customers in freight movements, they are looking for more standardisation and higher efficiencies with embedded safety. So we're being driven this way, which means these localised requirements should reduce over time. When I say over time, not next year, but in that 10 to 20 year time frame, you will see less and less need for more localised solution.
Thanks, Wayne. We'll go to some of the questions from the participants, and we'll stick with you, Wayne. So there's a question for you around inland rail. The question is, would it be possible to hear your view in relation to how ETCS will affect rail freight?
Yeah. Thanks. In very simple terms, the ability for us, both the efficiency but also the safety factor of what the system provides, I think we all know that we'll be better off in the long run with a combination of an ETCS framework as we head toward that. So imagine a train that travels from Fremantle Port, Westport, heading to Botany today across different networks, different trains. It's 4,000 kilometres. It's the width of Europe. And currently we've got in that order about 6 different requirements for either different rules or signalling systems through the course of that period. So if you think about that, we want to reduce that over time so it's more seamless. And inland rail is a fantastic opportunity now to embed what is the base case approach to train control and signalling system, which is the Inland Proprietary Limited, IPL, are underway with at the moment. So that will, even in the areas that are brownfield upgraded with signalling system in place, CTC, outside of that, we've got a common approach as a backdrop that leaves the pathway for ETCS system once we get through that business case. So that has been respected, already knowing that at some point in the future, we will be moving to a unified ETCS style system. Hopefully that answers the question whoever asked.
Thanks, Wayne. The next question, I might go over to you, Michael. It's great to hear about the changes we're making around standards and standards approvals, but in relation to rolling stock type approvals, which all RIMs would need to honour, the question is, will there be a body that needs to approve those? And the example we've given is a little bit like the federal department that overlooks road vehicles.
I think the short answer to that, in the short term, will there be an organisation? No. Now, it's not a bad thing to aspire to, I think, in the longer term. When we talked about the 3 mandatory standards at the beginning, and I said these were the things that ministers in particular thought we would get the greatest value out of enforced interoperability. 2 of those 3 standards are actually about digital train control. One of them's about the signalling system more broadly, and the other is about the driver's in-cab experience and wanting for that to be unified. But the third of those mandatory standards, the third part of that puzzle that ministers thought were critical, was about rolling stock approvals. And it wasn't so much about a single organisation in the way that the federal department does that now for the ADRs. And so for those who don't know, if a car wants to get into Australia, it needs to comply with the Australian design rules, and the federal department ticks that off. What we do want to do, though, is streamline those processes fairly radically. So at the moment, we know that RIMs are asking for various degrees of information. Some have application forms that are 5 pages long, some that are 50 pages long. We need to bring that together, and we need a greater amount of mutual recognition. I think where it becomes a bit tricky, and where I think we will always need some role for a local approval, is understanding the nature of local infrastructure. Our networks are very different. The local infrastructure is very different across the country. So to the extent that a train meets some sort of basic safety requirements, absolutely we should harmonise those. But there still needs to be a role for some local approval that a certain bit of rolling stock will work with a certain below rail set of infrastructure. At the moment, those two things are mixed together. And I'd love to be in a world and want to work towards a world where, at least for the stuff that isn't infrastructure dependent, that we can harmonise that and end up with a single process with mutual recognition across the country. Shouldn't need a single organisation to do that, but let's just at least have a single approach.
Thanks, Michael. We've got time for one last question, and looks like this one's probably best with you, Michael, again. So I think, Lockie, you're off the hook now. So, Michael, the question is around future harmonised standards. So an example being used is a standard on rail systems interoperability. If there is a need in the future for a standard to become mandatory, how does that operate in the new framework?
So we've obviously talked a little bit about the role of RISSB in the new standard model and in the new, particularly around harmonised standards. But we would see, and through the prioritising RISSB's, what will become RISSB's prioritisation framework, we would expect as part of that, if there's a view that from industry, from governments, that, you know what, this harmonised standard is much more important than we thought, we need to kick it upstairs to become a mandatory standard, then I would expect RISSB, industry and governments to provide that advice to the NTC, at which point we will put a proposition to ministers to say there is a strong view that this harmonised standard should become a mandatory standard. Do you agree? We recommend this, and then that would give us the authority to go away and draft the mandatory standard. And because it's a mandatory standard under Rail Safety National Law, we would then need to go and consult with industry as well.
Thanks, Michael. Well, thanks very much to all the panelists. I'm sure we could talk about standards for hours and hours, but I think importantly today on World Standards Day, it's very timely for us to have this conversation around the reform that's occurring in our rail sector, and importantly for us to keep having the conversations around what the three-tiered standards framework means. We're starting to have those conversations now around mandatory standards, how harmonised standards in the future will operate, and how RISSB's leadership of those harmonised standards will continue to operate in a co-regulated and industry-led way. And we chatted a little bit today around the fact that we still need to have that flexibility for local standards. So importantly, that we continue to have the opportunities to have these conversations and learn more about how the framework will operate. I think we also heard today that that there will be opportunities over the next 12 months to participate and to provide feedback through to the NTC's process around changes to the Rail Safety National Law, and where the detail, particularly around how some of those harmonised standards might operate and what greater authority there might be behind those standards, there will be opportunities to provide feedback and be part of a consultation as we work through the details with the NTC in the next 12 months. So on that note, I think it's been a really useful opportunity to get different perspectives on why standards are important for rail and the reform work that's occurring in the space. But I think importantly, it's a reminder that standards can only succeed if they are supported by industry, and we want to remain very much committed to an industry-driven and co-regulated standards model with the support of the NTC policy and legislative framework. So on that note, I thank you all for your attendance today, all your questions, and very odd, but I'm going to say it, I wish you all a very happy World Standards Day. Thanks kindly.
See you, everyone.